Okay. Let's hope it works today. Testing one, two, three. Okay. Well, let's see if it works. Hello. Dis&datInformation 822. August the 22nd. Looking at Fine and Saad-Filho. Chapter 4 in Marx's Capital on the circuit of industrial capital. And if there's time, we'll get to number 5. Volume 1 of Capital is largely self-contained. And it primarily gives a general analysis of capitalism and its process of development from the perspective of production. What are the social relations that allow capital to create surplus value, and how do these give rise to economic realities and social developments around production? The other 2 volumes of Capital are devoted both to elaborating and to extending this general analysis. For this reason, it is appropriate that the beginning of Volume 2 should analyze the circuit of capital. This is because the circuit provides the basis for understanding a whole series of phenomena: commercial, interest-bearing, and fixed capital, distribution of income and output, the turnover of capital, productive and unproductive labor in crises, as well as providing an economic structure in which the social relations of production analyzed in Volume 1 can be presented in more concrete form. In other words, Volumes 2 and 3 are about how the value relations of production, studied in Volume 1, give rise to more complex outcomes through the processes and structures of exchange and distribution. Volume 2 begins with an account of the money circuit of capital. This is an expansion of the characterization of capital as self-expanding value, see Chapter 3, the prior chapter, taking explicit account of the process of production. The general form of the circuit of industrial capital is M capital M dash capital C P C prime dash M prime. Under the most general circumstances, and regardless of the commodity produced, the industrial capitalists advance money capital M in order to purchase commodity inputs C, comprising labor power LP and means of production MP. It should be realized that money is necessary for these transactions, but does not in itself make them possible. It is the separation in ownership of labor power from the means of production, a class relation of production, that allows a definite group of people, that is the capitalists, to hire others, the workers, in exchange for a wage. This can be stressed by explicitly separating the means of production and labor power in the circuit of capital. M-C MPLP P C prime dash M prime. On purchase, the inputs C form productive capital. P, production proceeds as labor power is exercised on the means of production, and the result is different commodity outputs with a higher value C prime. C and C prime are linked to P by dots to indicate that production has intervened between the purchase of input C and sale of outputs C prime. The commodities produced are denoted by C prime not because their use value is different from that of the means of production, although this is generally the case, but because they contain surplus value over and above the value of the advanced capital M. This is shown by the sale of the output. For more money, capital M prime is greater than M. This is shown in Chapter 3, that surplus value lowercase s equals M prime dash M, or minus M, is created in production by the purchase of labor power at its value, which is less than the labor time expended, that is, value created in production. Surplus value makes its first appearance in commodity form immediately after production. Since the inputs, especially labor power, tools, machines, and buildings, seem symmetrical in their contribution to output, it is easy to credit the creation of surplus value to the productivity of all the factor inputs without distinction. Correspondingly, it is difficult to credit surplus value to the excess of actual over necessary labor time because the appearance of surplus value is delayed until after production has taken place, whereas the free exchange of labor power for its value takes place before production, even if the wages are paid in arrears. The produced value and surplus value is not converted into money by the sale of the output on the market. Having obtained sales income M prime, the capitalist can renew the circuit of capital either on the same scale by renewing the original advance M with given prices and technologies and spending the surplus value on consumption, or by embarking on an expanded productive circuit through the investment of part of the surplus value. See below and chapter 5. The circuit as a whole. It was shown above and in chapter 3 that capital is the social relation underpinning the self-expansion of value, or the production, appropriation, and accumulation of surplus value. Capital, as self-expanding value, is essentially the process of reproducing value and producing new value. The circuit of capital describes this motion, and it highlights that capital takes different forms in its reproduction process. The social relation that is capital successively assumes and relinquishes the forms of money, productive capital, and commodities. The circuit of industrial capital is best represented by a circular flow diagram, see figure 4.1. This circuit is important for laying out the basic structure of the capitalist economy and for showing how the spheres of production and exchange are integrated with one another through the movement of capital as surplus value is produced, distributed, and exchanged. As the circuit repeats itself, surplus value S, lowercase s, is thrown off. Thus, capital as self-expanding value embraces not only definite social relations of production, but is also a circular movement as it goes through its various stages repeatedly. So you can see that here. M to C, MPLP, then to P, then to C prime, then back to M, having thrown off S. And there are two spheres, the sphere of production and the sphere of exchange. If S is accumulated for use as capital, we can think of expanding reproduction as being represented by an outward spiral movement. Industrial capital changes successively into its three forms, that is, money capital, M, productive capital, P, and commodity capital, C prime. Each form presupposes the existence of the other two because it presupposes the circuit itself. This allows us to distinguish the specific function of each of the forms of capital from its general function as capital. In societies where they exist, money, factor inputs, and commodities can always function respectively as means of payment, means of production, and depositories of exchange value, but they only serve as industrial capital when they follow these functions sequentially in the circuit of capital. Then money capital acts as a means of purchasing labor power. Productive capital acts as a means of producing surplus value, and commodity capital acts as the depository of surplus value to be realized as money upon sale. In the movement through the circuit, two spheres of activity can be identified: production and circulation, that is, exchange. The sphere of production lies between C and C prime. In this sphere, use values are transformed and value and surplus value are created. This has profound implications for Marx's theory of distribution because it explains what there is to be distributed as well as the structures and processes of distribution of goods and values in the economy. The sphere of circulation contains the process of exchange between C prime and C and the realization of surplus value S. it was shown in Chapter 3 that even if capital and labor are employed and exchanged, they add no value to the output. This conclusion seems strange to mainstream economists because they're usually interested in obtaining a price theory by aggregating the supposedly independent contribution of all of the factors used in production and exchange. But Marx is interested in the social relations of production and distribution and in the structures of distribution of the values produced during the circuit. For example, he argues that whereas commercial capital adds no value, this does not prevent it from receiving a share of the surplus value produced. See Chapter 11. By constructing the circuit of capital in circular form, as in Figure 4.1, it becomes arbitrary to open and close the circuit with money capital, since a circle is neither beginning nor end. Note that the money circuit contains the interruption of the sphere of circulation by the sphere of production. In characterizing capital as a self-expanding value, it has been shown that the capitalist motive is to buy in order to sell more dearly. So, for capital seen from the perspective of the money circuit, production appears as a necessary but unfortunate and even wasteful interruption in the process of money making. Merchants and interest-bearing capital avoid this interruption, although they depend upon production taking place elsewhere. However, what is possible for an individual, merchant, or interest-bearing capitalist does not hold for all, or even most capitalists. If a nation's capitalists were seized by the attempt to make profit without the unavoidable link of production, they would find themselves in a speculative boom that would eventually crash. At this point, the economy would be brought back to the reality of the need for production, the only possible source of the value required to pay dividends, settle debts, service interest commitments, and clear financial obligations. See Chapters 7, 12, and 14. Marx also analyzes the circuit from two other perspectives, those of productive capital and commodity capital. The circuit of productive capital begins and ends with P, production. The purpose of the circuit appears to be production, and in so far as surplus value is accumulated, production on an extended scale. In contrast to the money circuit, for the productive circuit, the sphere of circulation appears as a necessary but unwanted intrusion in the process of production. But it's also been shown above that it is not sufficient to produce surplus value. It has to be realized on sale. Economists, more often than capitalists, tend to ignore this necessary but uncertain mediation by exchange. For a capitalist who unwittingly accumulates a growing inventory of commodities is soon brought back to reality with the loss of working capital. Finally, the circuit of commodity capital begins and ends with C prime, and so its purpose appears to be to satisfy society's consumption needs. As the sphere of circulation is followed by the sphere of production, neither sphere is interrupted by the other, so neither appears as unnecessary or wasteful. The three circuits of capital derive from the circuit as a whole. One might wonder why there are not four circuits of capital, with each node on the circuit, that is P, C prime, M, and C, forming a starting and finishing point. The reason C is not the basis for a circuit of capital is that it's not capital. The purchased means of production may be another capitalist commodity production and hence commodity capital. However, labor power is never capital until it is purchased, and then it becomes productive capital and not commodity capital, which must contain produced surplus value. Thus, while from a technical point of view, capitalism can be self-reliant for raw materials, it always and necessarily depends on the social reproduction of labor power from outside the pure system of production. See Chapter 5. This entails the use of political, ideological, and legal, as well as economic power in order to get the laborer to work. The same problems do not exist in getting a machine to work. It has been shown above that different views of capital's process of reproduction can be constructed, each according to one of the circuits of capital. These need not be uncritical of capitalism, but individually they are always inadequate. That is, stressing one or more of the processes of production, consumption, exchange, profit-making, and accumulation at the expense of the others. For example, only fleetingly, as they enter the circuit, do labor power and produced means of production appear separated. And then, not forming capital, they do not spontaneously generate a view of the circuit as a whole. Partly for this reason, mainstream economic theory appears to eliminate class relations altogether. However, these relations re-enter mainstream theory as distributional or exchange relations rather than relations of production. In contrast, the money circuit suggests models of exchange. For mainstream economics, the matching of supply and demand becomes the be-all and end-all, and capital and labor are seen as merely productive services. Difficulties are associated with the informational services performed by the price and interest rate mechanism. The productive circuit, in turn, tends to ignore the market, and neoclassical and most growth theories can be cited in this context. This yields an excellent input-output analysis of economic reproduction, but the economy is not clearly capitalist at all. Finally, the commodity circuit is reflected in neoclassical general equilibrium theory, where supply and demand harmoniously interact through production and exchange to yield final consumption. This circuit supports the myth that the purpose of production is consumption rather than profit or exchange, and is well illustrated by Edgeworth box diagrams familiar to economics students. One of the strengths of Marx's circuit of capital is to expose the limitations of these outlooks. At the same time, it reveals the functions of the forms in which capital appears and constructs a basis on which major economic categories and phenomena can be understood. So we've gotten to close to the end here. Marx's analysis of exchange, particularly in Volume 2 of Capital, has been relatively neglected despite the insights of others. Often, an approach has been adopted of complementing his theory of production with the Keynesian theory of effective demand, as if the two aspects of Marx's theory were subject to separate treatments. As suggested here, and in Marx's own account, production and exchange are structurally separated but integrally related through the circuits of capital. Marx's own analysis of the circuit of capital is developed in Marx, 1976, 78, etc. It is explained in Ben Fine, 1980, Chapter 2, and Alfredo Saad-Filho, 2002, Chapters 3 through 5. On Volume 2 of Capital, see Chris Arthur and Geert Ruden, 1998. And for similar interpretations to those offered here, see David Harvey, 1999, Chapter 3, and Roman Rudolsky, 1977, Part 4. The concepts of money and money as capital are explained by Kostas Lapavitsas, 2003, and Rudolsky, 1977, Part 3. Now, Chapter 5, Economic Reproduction. The previous chapter examined a single circuit of industrial capital. For capital as a whole, there are a large number of different circuits, each moving at its own pace and each expanding at its own rate. And these circuits must be integrated with each other. Marx analyzes these processes in Volume 2 of Capital by dividing the economy into the two broad sectors. Department 1, which produces means of production, MP, purchased with constant capital, lowercase c, and Department 2, which produces means of consumption, purchased by workers out of the wage equivalent of variable capital, lowercase v, and by capitalists out of surplus value, lowercase s. This chapter examines the process of reproduction of capital as a whole. It begins with simple reproduction where there is no capital accumulation. It subsequently examines expanded reproduction, where part of the surplus value is invested. Finally, it considers the social reproduction of the capitalist economy. Simple reproduction. In Figure 5.1, the balance between Departments 1 and 2 in conditions of simple reproduction is illustrated by a flow diagram showing values and commodities from each sector and money. The two circuits are shown. M1-C1 ... P ... C'1 -M'1 and M2 dash C2 dot 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 P2 C prime 2 dash M prime 2, with M prime 1 and M prime 2 being absorbed into the central pool of money M, after which they flow out again. The figure also shows the commodity flows. These go in the opposite direction to the money that is used to purchase them, with workers and capitalists buying consumption goods from Department 2 with their wages V1 and V2 and surplus value S1 and S2, and capitalists buying means of production C1 and C2 from Department 1. Workers do not buy means of production, and we ignore savings. So to look at this again, it does, in fact, resemble an Edwards box, among other things. So you can see M, C2, P2, C prime 2, and then M, C, C1, P1, C prime 1, and the associated breakdown of lowercase c, v, and s. So you have production, exchange in the center, and production yet again, sort of a double circuit in that particular context. If there is no technical change, and if the capitalists spend all their surplus value on consumption and merely repeat the previous pattern of production, the economy can reproduce itself at the same level of activity. Now, this is what Marx calls simple reproduction, which implies a certain balance between the values produced by the two departments. The value of the output of Department 1 is C1 plus V1 plus S1, and the value of its sales of means of production is C1 plus C2. So in simple reproduction, C1 plus V1 plus S1 equals C2 plus C1 plus C2. For Department 2, similarly, the equality of values of output and value of sales of means of consumption gives C2 plus V2 plus S2 equals V1 plus V2 plus S1 plus S2. Each of the expressions simplifies to V1 plus S1 equals C2. Now, this is Marx's famous equation for balance between the two departments in simple reproduction. If the capitalists do not consume their entire surplus value but spend part of it buying additional means of production, capital accumulation takes place. In this case, capitalist purchases of means of production, C1 plus V1 plus S1, for the next period exceed current use, C1 plus C2, and it follows that for expanded reproduction, C2 plus C1 plus C1 is greater than C1 plus C2, therefore V1 plus S1 is greater than C2, with the extent of the inequality depending on the rate of accumulation. Marx's reproduction schema have been interpreted in various ways. One of the most popular is that they offer an analysis of conditions of economic equilibrium, either static, in the case of simple reproduction, or dynamic, that is, expanded reproduction. Alternatively, taking mainstream growth theory as its model, expanded reproduction is seen simply as an enlarged version of simple reproduction. The economy looks the same in all respects, except that it's bigger. Neither interpretation is within the spirit of Marx's analysis. First, his methodology is sharply opposed to the use of equilibrium as an organizing concept for the analysis of capitalism. Second, in the reproduction schema, Marx is concerned to show how, despite the seemingly chaotic coordination of producers in exchange, both simple and expanded reproduction exists within the capitalist system. In other words, simple and expanded reproduction are not alternatives, either theoretically or empirically. Rather, the former, that is simple reproduction, exists within the latter, that is expanded production. Expanded reproduction simultaneously depends upon and breaks with the conditions associated with simple reproduction that are its starting point, both in aggregate value magnitudes and in the values of commodities themselves, as these are subject to productivity increase as a result of accumulation. Furthermore, Marx never draws the implication, as in general equilibrium theory, or for the proponents of laissez-faire, that different producers and consumers are harmoniously coordinated through the market at high levels of employment of resources. Rather, Marx's schema points to three separate balances required by the reproduction and accumulation of capital. The first is in values, as has been illustrated above. The second is in money and prices, since the circuit requires these to balance as flows take place. And third, the need for balance applies to use values too, for the appropriate quantities of commodities have to be produced and exchanged with each other, both within and between the two departments. According to the schema above, the value quantities displayed have an unspecified quantitative relationship to the use values involved. However, they cannot be entirely independent of each other. Given these value flows, asymmetric productivity growth, for example, would lead to the transfer of resources between the two departments, 1 and 2, and to a change in the use value flows between them. And therefore, Marx's balance between the two departments must involve not only the coordination across the economy between the value flows already specified, together with the complementary flows of money, whose magnitudes are determined by the price system, but also the balance of flows of use values determined by technology, the composition of the output, and so on. The diagram of economic reproduction in figure 5.1 can be used to reinforce the partial views of the economy that were presented in the light of the single circuit of capital in the previous chapter. Little is added qualitatively, but the figure suggests what might be considered to be the factors determining the level of economic activity. Note first that mainstream economic theory and ideology tend to focus on the central box of exchange activity, relative to which the two spheres of production appear to be extraneous. Generally, this supports the erroneous view that production can be taken for granted, or that it's simply a technical relation that forms the unproblematic basis for exchange relations, as in the neoclassical production function. Now, this is most apparent for neoclassical general equilibrium theory, where free market exchanges are considered sufficient to guarantee equality of supply and demand at full employment of economic resources. And in stability analysis, it becomes a question of whether disproportion between the various quantities embodied within the circuits is self-correcting through price movements in response to excess supplies and demands. For Keynesian theory, the role of aggregate demand becomes determinant. If we focus on the investment multiplier, the level of C1 plus C2 assumes a central role. If we also include the role of consumption, then this expenditure out of national income, that is V1 plus V2 plus S1 plus S2 also becomes important. In this form, the consumption function has more affinity with the post-Keynesian methods of determining aggregate demand, in which income is divided into wages and profits. But the important point remains that from these perspectives, a particular set of expenditure flows drives aggregate economic activity. However, in these approaches, there is no role for the production of surplus value in the conflict between capital and labor over this fundamental economic relation. A more sophisticated post-Keynesian economics includes the role of money. In this approach, the level of economic activity is determined by the size of the flows of money streaming out of the central pool M. If these are restricted, either because of entrepreneurial timidity or through contradictory monetary policies imposed by the central bank, the economy will falter. The roles of the banking system and the rate of interest are taken up in Chapter 12. Here, it is important to note that from this point of view, the source of unemployment is to be found in insufficient exchange activity, which determines the inability of the economy to generate profitability. In Keynes's own theory, this depends largely on waves of pessimism, in which poor expectations about business profitability and expectations of high interest rates become self-fulfilling prophecies. More generally, recent developments within mainstream economic theory have given so-called rational expectations a considerably enhanced role in determining the path of the economy. Finally, a more radical theory of the economy views the level of economic activity as being determined by distributional relations between capital and labor. Such a view is associated ideologically with both the right and the left, with the former, that is, the right, arguing that the power of trade unions needs to be curbed to restore profitability, and the latter arguing that the conflicts involved are irreconcilable within the confines of capitalism. Analytically, this outlook depends on a fixed cake understanding of the economy in which national income, V1 plus V2 plus S1 plus S2, is divided between the two classes, with one gaining only at the expense of the other. For example, if wages represented by V1 plus V2 rise too much, then profits represented by S1 plus S2 must fall, and this undermines both the motive and the ability to accumulate. Despite its radical appearance, this view diverges sharply from Marx's own presentation of the structure of the capitalist economy. The attribution of a central role to distribution and the determination of profitability is only possible by confining the analysis to one part of the arena of exchange. Once the sphere of production is incorporated as well, the apparent symmetry between capital and labor in distributional relations and in receiving profits and wages out of national income evaporates. For the payment of wages is a precondition for the production process to begin, or more exactly, this is true of the purchase of labor power whose actual payment may well come later. In contrast, profits are the residual after the payment of wages and other production costs, rather than being a slice of the cake, so to speak, with a size that may be negotiated in advance. For Marx, the distributional relations between capital and labor are not of the fixed cake variety. Even if, ceteris paribus, profits are higher if wages are lower, although post-Keynesians might argue otherwise in view of inadequate demand. Profits depend first and foremost on the ability of capitalists to extract surplus value in production. Whatever the level of wages, the capitalists need to coerce labor to work over and beyond the labor time required to produce those wages, with a productivity that depends both on the machinery available and on the level of discipline in the workplace. Uncertainty about the production of surplus value is only one of the aspects of uncertainty facing the capitalists. 4 other types of uncertainty are also relevant. First, having produced surplus value, capitalists are uncertain about how much can be realized until the output is sold. Second, the extraction of surplus value under competitive conditions leads to continuous productivity-enhancing technical change. However, it was shown above that technical change disrupts the value and use value balances in the economy and may contribute to antagonistic relations on the shop floor, further increasing uncertainty. Third, as is shown in chapters 12 and 14, credit makes the resources of the entire financial system available to individual capitalists, facilitating an accumulation of capital that cannot always be sustained and creating conditions which may lead to financial and economic crisis. For example, credit might mislead industrial capitalists into anticipating favorable returns when none is forthcoming. And when fresh credit is used to pay for maturing obligations, the overexpansion of accumulation might create conditions of economic crisis. Finally, uncertainty becomes even greater when trading in money itself takes place, creating a class of money dealers only loosely connected to production and trade. Trading in money and money-related instruments is likely to lead to destabilizing speculation and fraud, creating further uncertainty even for those not directly involved in such activities. On the one hand, for Marx, the production of absolute and relative surplus value is crucial for the understanding of distributional relations, but the latter cannot be read off from production conditions alone. On the other hand, uncertainty generated by capitalist production, rather than the shifting humors of industrial and Financial capitalist plays an essential role in the production of surplus value as well as in the unleashing of crises. Social reproduction. The previous sections have focused on simple and expanded reproduction from within the economic system alone. In principle, with one crucial exception, the circuits of capital appear to be self-sustaining. The striking exception is labor power, whose reproduction requires first that the provision of wage goods is adequate for that purpose. Second, by virtue of the workers' freedom once the working day is over, as well as their resistance on the shop floor and outside, capital has little control over the processes of reproduction of the workforce. And in a sense, this is where social reproduction takes over. The latter involves a complex array of non-economic relations, processes, structures, powers, and conflicts that, interpreted in narrow terms, includes the processes necessary for the reproduction of the workforce, both biologically and as compliant wage workers. More generally, social reproduction is concerned with how society as a whole is reproduced and transformed over time. In short, and largely appropriately, social reproduction has become an umbrella term within which to gather all non-economic factors. It covers the entire ground between the abstract category of capital and the empirical reality of capitalism. But even this is only a partial understanding of the scope and significance of social reproduction. Capitalism clearly depends upon satisfactory economic as well as social reproduction, of which economic reproduction is a part. Misperception of the relationship between the two is commonplace, as if economic reproduction and social reproduction were separate from one another, like work and home. To a large extent, the inappropriate juxtaposition of the economic and the social, that is, the latter as a political, cultural, or any kind of superstructure, is most marked in the disciplinary boundaries between the social sciences. Now, one of the most significant sites of social and economic reproduction is the state. Through the state are constituted and expressed political relations, processes, and conflicts that are distinct from, but not independent of, those of economic reproduction. The extent to which the state is dependent upon the economy is highly controversial. Views range, to put it in somewhat one-dimensional terms, from those in which the state is reducible to economic, especially capitalist imperatives, to those in which the state is seen as autonomous from the economy. The nature of the capitalist state will be taken up in Chapter 15, but the issues here of what has been termed reductionism on the one hand and autonomy on the other are of more general methodological, theoretical, and empirical significance. The important point is to recognize both the causal significance of the capitalist economy for the non-economic, that is, what sort of state, property law, customs, politics, and so on, prevail in each kind of society. Economic reproduction. Similar considerations apply to those areas of social reproduction that lie outside the immediate orbit of the state, what is often referred to as civil society. Social reproduction also depends upon the household or family system and the more general areas of private activity, not least consumption and other activities of the working class that induce and enable it to present itself for work on a daily basis. The emphasis so far has been upon the social reproduction of labor, but economic reproduction is equally dependent upon the formation and transformation of the conditions that enable the circuits of capital as a whole to be reproduced, not least the market and monetary and credit systems, which require laws, regulations, and so on. These inevitably promote the interests of some capitalists at the expense of others, as well as preventing rivalry between capitalists from being unduly destructive. Such matters are equally the subject of politics, the state, and civil society. At the abstract level of this introductory exposition, only the conditions necessary for and induced by economic reproduction can be identified, along with the way in which economic and social reproduction are structured in relation to one another. How is the accumulation of capital accommodated socially and conflict over it contained? To progress further than this, it is necessary to introduce historical specificity, a task beyond the scope of this text. Issues and further reading. As suggested in the previous chapter, Marx's analysis in Volume 2 of Capital has been neglected and so has been relatively free of controversy. For further analysis of Volume 2, with some emphasis on the three different but integrally related circuits of capital associated with money capital, productive capital, and commodity capital, and with implications for economic ideology and crisis, see Ben Fine's 1975 book. The same cannot be said of social reproduction. This has been heavily debated, whether within Marxism or against it. Controversy covers the relationship between the economic and the non-economic, and how they do or do not depend upon one another, and the different aspects of the non-economic itself, from the nature of the autonomy of the state and politics to the role of civil society. So this chapter focuses on certain Marx material. Part 3, the interpretation of social reproduction developed above, draws upon Ben Fine's 1992 and 2013 text, Ben Fine and Ellen Leopold's 1993 text, and Ben Fine, Michael Haseman, and Judith Wright's 1996 book. Also John Weeks' books, hitherto not neglected in the literature. The value of labor power and the reproduction of the working class are discussed by Ben Fine's texts from 1998 to 2012, and then Lapavitsas and Saad-Filho, 2004, etc. And an interesting Ben Fine debate with Michael Leibowitz in 2008, 2009, and then sort of recapitulated in Leibowitz 2006, 2010. And I just put this in to remind me, as I didn't identify it properly in 2 chapters ago, is what lambdas look like. I hadn't seen it in a while. And so I added that onto the text itself. So we've covered chapters 4 and 5 and Ben Fine and the Alfredo Saad-Filho text. And we got through a little early, which is good. And so we will return to our regularly scheduled program. In terms of weekly Marx, we will continue on with a kind of parallel reading and perhaps a little bit more adventurous, much to our horror. I have included where we're going to go and where we're going to continue to go in the Fine and Saad-Filho text, where the next is chapters on accumulation of capital, capitalism in crisis, composition of capital, and the falling rate of profit. And this really does cover the kinds of sort of trenchant areas for coverage. Okay.